went to bed thinking about it. I woke up the next day praying about it, and it was just what happens for me a lot of times. I feel like God is throwing something in my direction, and it just kind of takes life and stuff. So it was taking on a life on Sunday, and I started to really take a good look at it. It was a story. It is a story that we've all read, I'm sure, a familiar one. But what I want to do is take a look at it tonight. But instead of going right to the story, somebody said to me years ago that when it comes to like reading the Bible, studying, whatever, that sometimes you're a long distance swimmer and sometimes you're a deep sea diver. So in other words, sometimes you go through and you read a chapter to 3 chapters, you're long distance, and sometimes you just get to one verse and you just get deep into that one verse, deep sea diver. So we're kind of going for the long distance swimmer here, even though the story, we're going to read it from Mark 8. It's also found in Matthew 16. We're going to go back a couple chapters and work our way into it. Sometimes we take a story, and I'm not saying that we misunderstand it because we take it out of context, but a lot of times we don't, because we only read the story, let's say, a particular event. We miss what led up to that event, and perhaps miss what's actually going on, that if we had read into it, we would get the right kind of message from it, or something besides what we're getting just by looking at it in an isolated fashion. So we're not going to read every verse of Mark 6, 7 to get to chapter 8. I do want to highlight some things, though, that I think we need to pick up along the way and keep in mind about the story, the actual story, that we're going to read. At the beginning of Mark 6, you remember, again, like I say, we won't read all the verses. If people have their Bibles, what I would like to do is have you read a verse here and there, though. For instance, so Mary, would you get Mark in the 6th chapter, the 7th verse? Get ready to read that. Jesus is actually rejected at Nazareth, and I don't know if you remember it, but he's rejected at Nazareth. But the reason why he's rejected is because they only know him as Joseph's son. In other words, they don't come into the full identity of Jesus. And because they don't come into the full identity of Jesus, it works as unbelief against them, to the point where it says Jesus couldn't do anything. He did a few things, but not much, because of that unbelief. And what's really being said is because he wasn't given the honor for who he actually was and identified for who he actually was, it was considered unbelief. The key for me is, yes, I get the unbelief bit, but the thing is, when we think that we've kind of like got Jesus, I know Jesus, I got him, done with him, I think we have to be really careful what we think and who we think we actually know, the one who's continuing to reveal himself in greater measure. Let's put it this way. On the island of Patmos, when Jesus appears to John, John turns and sees him, practically has a heart attack, because he sees this one that he's never seen before like that. It's one of the reasons the book is called The Revelation of Jesus Christ. After walking with him for 60 years, he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And he sees Jesus. And all of a sudden, Jesus starts saying things like, I am the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning. And John, he's done. He hits the deck. He's through. But this is the same Jesus that he's known for 90 years, between 60 and 80 years, someplace in there. But he's having a greater revelation. I'm just saying that this whole story starts, and if we keep it in the back of our mind, we're going to be reading a story, but we're actually starting from a place of misidentification. Would you read that 7th verse of Mark 6?
And he summoned the 12 and began to send them out in pairs, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits.
Depending on the translation you have, it says he called them to himself. But to himself are the key words. In other words, I can feel it in the room when we're worshiping, like for instance tonight, that everybody in the room is sensing a calling to him. Yeah, there's things that he has for us to do. We've talked and prayed about missions trips and a variety of things that are going on. But we need to remember his calling is to him. When you're talking, well, I've got a calling. Well, I hope you realize your first calling is to him. And then he sends us out to do things, which is what that was saying. Jesus is rejected at Nazareth. He moves on. He calls the 12 to himself, and he sends them out on a missions trip, basically. But the key is that he calls us to himself. You remember that bit when it says, Lord, Lord, didn't I do this? Didn't I do that? He says, I don't even know you. I'm sure you had a great ministry, but what's that got to do with me? I didn't send you. As we continue to move on through Mark 6, we have to remember John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin. So when we read about John the Baptist being beheaded, I'm guessing everybody in here has relatives of some kind, probably cousins. And these guys were not like children, they were in their 30s, and John the Baptist gets beheaded by Herod. And it's the first time that Herod is mentioned in this sequence. He's the one who has John the Baptist's head lopped off. Herod becomes a representation of world systems, of governments, that, remember, God is the one who has ordained governments, but they were ordained as servants to God. And when they stop serving God and start serving their own interests, they're lopping off the prophetic voice. We don't have to look very far in America to see how far the prophetic voice goes into speaking into the government. Right now, there is what feels like an organized effort from government to stifle and shut down the prophetic voice. They might as well be chopping our heads off. It's a bit like that. It's not a new story. So the first time Herod is mentioned here is as the one who chops off. He's the government system, the world systems that are always looking to silence the prophetic voice, to behead it, if you will. In Mark chapter 6, verses 30 and 31, do you want to read it, Aaron?
Yes, I got it. And the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Go aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat.
So immediately following this beheading of John the Baptist, the guys return from their missions trip. They're telling Jesus everything that happened, and he says, let's go have a rest. He pulls them aside. Let's go to a deserted place and have a rest. This is immediately following John the Baptist's beheading. And I really kind of hear him saying, you need a rest, you've been on the missions trip, it's been a lot of hard work and all that. But at the same time, if we put ourselves in their position, Jesus knows his future. He knows what they've just done to John. He's looking at the boys. He knows their future. And I am sure he's saying, you know what? For the time being, this is not really the best place to be hanging out. He's not in fear that Herod's going to collect them all and chop their heads off. But he is concerned that if you're Peter or James or John and you're in that place where Herod is chopping people's heads off, it's gonna mess up your thinking and your ability to be able to really understand what Jesus is talking about, to go forward in a variety of ways. In other words, I do believe he pulls them aside to get a rest, but he's pulling them aside to get them out of that situation. John's disciples are burying John. Jesus takes his disciples and says, you know what? Let's go to the other side of the lake and have a little break here. You've come off a missions trip. In other words, I think there's a lot going on with this when Jesus pulls them aside and takes them across for a rest, what he calls a rest. As they cross the other side, multitudes are all over Jesus. He's healing all of them. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And in the Gospels, it takes the time to say Jesus had compassion. Now, I want to hold on to that word for the rest of the night, while we're going through this. Compassion. He had compassion. In Mark chapter 6, would you read verses 34, 35, and 36?
And when he went ashore, he saw a great multitude, and he felt compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it was already quite late, his disciples came up to him and began saying, "The place is desolate, and it is already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat."
Jesus has compassion on the multitudes. He's going to feed 5,000 people, make them sit down. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures." So the shepherd's being identified. Make them lie down in green pastures, because that's what the good shepherd does in Psalm 23. Make them lie down in green pastures. He feeds the 5,000 in the green pastures where he's made them lie down. That's what he's made them to do, right? He feeds the 5,000, but you notice what's happened. There's something that he says when he says they're like sheep without a shepherd. That's the way he sees this multitude of people. His disciples, they're the ones that say, send them away. And they've got their reasons for saying that. We're out, there's no food out here. Why would we keep them out here? It's been a long day, one day. It's been a long day. Send them away so they can get some food in the neighboring villages. And Jesus is the one in verse 38 who's going to say, how many loaves do you have? He's going to say, feed. How many loaves do you have? Now, all of these things, I'm giving you a lot in terms of, you're not going to be able to remember all of it. But when we get to the story, all of a sudden it's going to go, oh my goodness. Because you will remember me saying these from the scriptures. Jesus has had compassion. The disciples' response is, send them away. And Jesus is like, no, that's not a representation of compassion. Compassion is bring them to me. I'll go to them. The last thing you want to do is send them away. But that's the disciples' solution. Send them away. And it seems like a compassionate one, doesn't it? There's no food here. They can get food over there. Send them to where the food is. Jesus' question, first time he'll ask, how many loaves do you have? Remember, the Bible's a spiritual book. We always read it on two levels. We're reading stories right now that actually happened, but the Holy Spirit is still asking, so how many loaves do you have? And just hold that as a question the Spirit of God asks. How many loaves do you have? As it goes on, he feeds the 5,000, tells them to get in the boat and go back to the other side. Jesus ends up walking on water, going out to save them, so to speak. In Matthew's account, Peter walks on water as well, and then he sinks. We know the story, and Jesus says to him, why did you doubt, O you of little faith? But it's out when he's walking on the water, when he says to them, be of good cheer in the storm. Be, I am, be not afraid. Those are the three things. Be of good cheer, I am here, I am. And then he cautions them, be not afraid. They become three very powerful kinds of directions. Aaron, would you go to Matthew 14 and read the 33rd verse, Matthew 14:33? And Mary, if you're still in Mark 6, would you read verse 52? First Matthew 14:33.
Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, you are truly the Son of God.
That was after Jesus walked on water and got in the boat. All the boys who were in the boat said, you are truly the Son of God. That's a huge confession, a recognition. You are truly the Son of God. After they saw him walking on the water. This is following the feeding of the 5,000. In Mark 6:52,
For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened.
saying that the reason why,
So the same group that says you're truly the Son of God, now they're
yes, this is the same exact account between Mark and Matthew. They're recording different things. Matthew is recording this tremendous, they worshipped him, it says actually. They worshipped him and said, truly you are the Son of God. At the same time, Mark, whose gospel was written previously, which is always interesting to see who wrote after who. Mark left them with, actually when we were in the boat, we were all afraid because we didn't really put it together. We really didn't understand the miracle of the loaves because our hearts were not in a good place. Our hearts were hardened. Now, it's not because they were terrible, wicked men. You have to remember, in the Old Testament, the law was written on 2 pieces of stone. In the New Testament, it says the law is written on hearts of flesh. So they're still coming from hard hearts, hearts that are still of stone, so to speak, where the law is etched in stone instead of the Word of God in our hearts, if you follow what I mean. They're transitioning, they're learning and they're growing with Jesus. It's not a put down, it's just a statement of fact. We can only be where we are in our spiritual growth. We talked about the rich young ruler. He was not put down. It's just that he was where he was at as a young man, and in order to take the next step in his spiritual growth, this is what was necessary. Mark whose gospel is written as dictated from Peter, is just saying, we were in the boat. The reason why we freaked out was we didn't have the insight, the understanding. We really hadn't considered what that loaves thing was all about. Our hearts were hardened. They were in a hard place. It's not a put down. It's not, oh, I'm so wicked. That's not what he's saying. He's saying this was our condition. But in that condition, Matthew adds, you're right, Peter, but I was in the boat too. And there was this worshiping of Jesus, and we said, so you put these things together, which is why I like the various accounts. They don't contradict. They actually fill in all the gaps for us. Chapter 6, where we're not going to read from. It's when they get to, after he walks on water, they get to the other side, and in John 6, that's where you get, I don't even know how many verses, where Jesus begins his series of I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world. His first one is I am the bread of life. How many loaves do you have? He's fed the 5,000 previously. But the question really is that it doesn't matter how many loaves of real bread you have. How many loaves of bread do you have? Well, I have one, the bread of life. That's the one loaf I need. That's the only loaf I need, really. How many loaves do you have? Jesus, John goes on and on about Jesus being the bread of life. You see, the thing with Jesus, which we're going to see in a minute, the thing with Jesus is that he doesn't do a teaching just as a good teacher. He lives it. So if he says, I'm the bread of life, and does a teaching on the bread of life, he feeds thousands of people with bread. When he uses words, they're connected to his works. If you don't believe what I'm saying, Jesus says, at least believe my works, because at least they testify my words. His words and his works are the same. He's not a Sunday morning preacher. He doesn't get up on a Sunday morning and spew out a 45-minute, wow, what a sermon. He doesn't do that. When he does that and says, I am the bread of life, he feeds thousands of people. First 5,000 and then 4,000. Because he's the bread of life. His words and his works line up. It's one of the huge things that kind of is lacking a bit in the body of Christ today. A lot of words, not a lot of action. A lot of confessions of faith, not a lot of doing associated with the confession of faith. As Mark 6 ends, they're going off to Gennesaret. And I don't expect you guys to know or to remember or think about Gennesaret.
Is that where the demoniac was? No.
No, it's the Gadarenes. But Gennesaret is where Luke, in Luke chapter 5, is where Peter finally drops everything and really follows the Lord. It's his third calling. And Jesus says, come on, let's go over there. Peter has just, I love Jesus so much. I just love him so much. Peter's the one who just sank in the sea. Brings tears to my eyes. He sank. And Jesus knows it was a little bit of a faith. He was looking at his surroundings, and it caused him to consider his surroundings more than he considered the one that called him to come. So he sinks. So what do you do with a boy who has just sunk? And you've identified the situation, it's your faith. You bring him back to a place where he really got it. And it's like saying, remember this place, Peter? Remember I told you that you would catch men, you'd be a fisher of men, and you've been following me. Come on, Peter. Let the sinking bother, don't let it put you off. It hasn't put me off. You did walk on water, and I got news for the entire human race. He's the only one that did it besides me. It's my boy. You could just hear Jesus just building Peter up again. And it says that they actually, when they got there, the way Mark words it, he says that they anchored there. Slammed in the anchor. This is where we're staying. And I really believe, see, the more I read the Gospels, the more I see more and more of what Jesus is actually doing. I think it's probably because you get to know Jesus more and more, and you get to learn and know his style a bit more and more. As he's anchored there, people are swarming all over him, and he continues to heal them. We move into Mark 7, and that's where the Pharisees show up, is in Mark 7. It says the Pharisees came from Jerusalem. And what's going to happen is we're going to have a bit of a discussion about defilement. A bit of a discussion about defilement. We started from a place of Jesus not being identified for who he is. He calls them to himself. Herod is introduced. Jesus stresses that he has compassion. The disciples are the ones that say, send them away. But Jesus is the one who says, be of good cheer. I am. Don't be afraid. I am the bread of life. And whatever he says, he does. The Pharisees show up. The issue is defilement. They're concerned about his disciples eating without washing their hands. Mark 7:2.
And had seen that some of his disciples were eating the bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed.
What were they eating?
It says
Right.
Right. Got to follow the crumbs through these passages.